Great. Well, welcome. My name is Paul Merrill. I'm from Beaufort Fairmont Automated Testing Services, and I'm here today to talk with you about making the case for full-time test automation engineers. And if you know me and you know Beaufort Fairmont, you know that we focus on test automation. We eat, sleep, and breathe test automation. This is what we do. We go around the country talking to different clients, working with them on project work, consulting, training, these types of things, and helping them solve a couple problems. Things like, how do I sync up dev and testing in agile environments? And how do I make my regression testing automated? Things of that nature. Lately, I've been getting the same question again and again, and that is about test automation engineers and how involved they should be in test automation engineering, how much they should be doing testing, how can we divide up their activities, and what does that role actually look like? And so I wanted to take a minute and kind of talk through it and spend some time today on that. I also wanted to make sure that we define what that role is and make a case for it. So many of you are managers or in senior management executives, and you're either making a case to hire someone as a full-time test automation engineer, or you're receiving that case and you want to know whether or not it makes sense. So I want to talk to you about that. We can definitely help people find these individuals as well, and it's some of what we do remotely from here. So once again, thank you so much for being here this Thursday afternoon. And let's get going. So a couple things as we get started here. You should be able to see my face. You should also be able to see my screen, which is slides. And right now you should be seeing upcoming events. If there are any problems with that, make sure to use your GoToWebinar control panel. And you can either send me a chat message or send a question, something of that nature, and I ought to be able to see it. If you see me off looking over to the right, that's where I have my control panel, and I'm trying to pay attention to what you all are saying and what you're doing and all of that. So a couple upcoming events. Tonight I'm going to be out at TriTog, which is the Triangle Test Automation Users Group. It's one that I help coordinate here in Raleigh, North Carolina. I live in Cary and work in Cary, but the group is in Raleigh, North Carolina. So that's going to be a very interesting talk about innovation within the digital world these days. So make sure to get out to that tonight at 6 o'clock at Pendo. The 21st, I'll be out at NCPMI. That's an annual conference for PMI, which is Project Management Institute in Raleigh. I'm looking forward to that. I'll be down in Orlando at Agile 2017. So I know a couple of my friends and possibly people who are on here right now are going to be out at that in August, and I'm looking forward to talking about machine learning there and how it affects testers. The 9th of August, I'll be doing a webinar for STPCon, and if you're not aware of STPCon, this is a terrific conference. It's one where we have a really great set of speakers. Some of the well-known folks are going to be there this year. The next one is in December. In August, names like, and I'll talk about again today, Angie Jones is someone that I'm going to be quoting from today. Mike Lyles, our keynote speaker for the TISCA conference coming up here in the Triangle area in February of next year. Mary Thorne is usually out there. Bob Galen is usually out there. Lots of good names. Mark Tomlinson. I believe that we've got some other big names like Jason Huggins doing a keynote, the developer for the Selenium project, the original one. So I look forward to that conference. That's in DC this year. I'll be doing a webinar on the 9th, and that conference is actually in September. I'll also be doing the next one of these webinars on the 17th. So now that we've got all that out of the way, let's go somewhere for this. So I put this note out on Twitter. I love being on Twitter. I love talking testing on Twitter. Make sure to follow me, Paul Merrill, on Twitter. And my friend Boz over in Amsterdam responded when I put this out there. I said, you know, I'm going to be talking about making the case for full-time test automation engineers. And he says, test automation is a craft requiring dedicated crafts women. Great topic, Paul. Registered. If you don't know Boz, he is an expert in testing and an expert in test automation, and he's dived very deep into service virtualization and written an ebook about it. Make sure to look that up and get it. It's a free ebook, and it's a very good one. But I love that Boz jumped in. The friendly tester jumped in, Richard Bradshaw, who's also a well-known keynote speaker in the test arena and a strong test automation person himself. He says, I'm game if they're working closely with the team, building tools. When it's fixing, adding checks all the time, something is broken. So, you know, Richard's been doing this for a long time. He's a very strong mind in this industry, and I hear what he's saying, and I think underlying a lot of what I'm going to be saying today is the fundamental assumption that when we're working on a team, we're interacting with that team, we're working with others on the team, we're working closely with them, we're finding out what the other members of the team need and providing those services to them as if they're a customer, and they're doing something in exchange for us, something likewise. So those are some of the things that are fundamentally kind of underlying this. And everybody's got their own perspective on this and what it means to be a test automation engineer and how we name them and things like that. Today I'm going to be using the words test automation engineer or automation engineer, and by that what I mean is someone who's writing code for test automation, for test assist, things of that nature. So please understand I'm not just talking about someone who is copying manual scripts over into automation. I've never done this talk before, by the way. This is my first time doing it, so if it seems a little rough, that's why. You're getting a first glimpse at it. So one of the things that I like to ask clients when I go out and talk to them is, what is your vision? What is your goal? What do you see happening in your organization with test automation? Where is this going to be a year from now? Where is it going to be 3 months from now? What does your end goal look like with this? And I would love to hear some thoughts on that. I'll just open it up here for a minute. So if you'd like to type in a question or a thought on this, if you want to raise your hand, I will try to recognize you and pull you off of mute. And I'd love to hear what your goals are for test automation in your environment. What is that vision of ultimate test automation look like to you? And I know that it takes a few minutes to type into this question box or the chat or whatever. I'm looking out for those right now. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about this, because I think everyone's different on this. And I'm looking for folks. We don't have many volunteers today. There's about 40 or 50, I guess between 40 and 50 folks on the call right now, so you're not talking in front of a huge audience if you're going to join in. Here's one from Frank. So he says, configuring separate environments for test runs and CI integration. Okay, so and how does the business benefit from these things? What is it that we actually get out of this? So your vision may be technical in this case. It sounds like Frank's is, that this is each separate environment configured to run tests within CI using CI to kick them off. That's a great vision. Any others that we have before we go on? I just kind of want to get other thoughts before I share some of the visions that I hear from time to time. Give it just another minute here. Okay, here's one. I want test automation on UI and more on microservices, from Kunal. So I appreciate that, Kunal. So some people want to see automation running in different places. That's great. And I guess when I'm looking at this, what I'm looking for is to hear, what is your grand vision for your organization? What does it look like? And I've used this picture before in presentations. It's one of my favorites. But over on the right here, you've got a bunch of bots that represent our test automation. And I think a lot of times what management, executives, test automation engineers, developers, testers, what we want, product owners, what we want out of test automation is we want a whole lot of automated bots going out and testing our systems in one way or the other, checking to make sure that they're working correctly. And we'd really love it to be happening for all of our applications, all the configurations of our applications. We want to know fundamentally that at all times our application is working as we expect it. Let's see, I've got a couple other thoughts here coming in. Let me just see what these are. Automation enhanced by AI, that would be cool. Thanks, Tom. That's a cool one, and I'm looking forward to seeing that soon from some folks that are working on that kind of stuff. Neha says, okay, well, this is a question I'm going to have to come back to later, Neha. But so I think a lot of people have this grand vision that test automation is going to be running, it's going to do a whole lot of labor, and we're all going to be able to sit back with a really nice pina colada on a beach in the Mediterranean somewhere and hang out. All of our testers can hang out while this test automation just runs and does great things. I think that there are other folks that envision taking a deployment system, a system of development, the development process, and changing it from something that's clunky and slow to something that's running very fast. And I think that this is what DevOps and continuous delivery both aspire to, and test automation is needed for those to work. And I think that each of those in the right situation can make perfect sense for a given organization. We can reduce labor. We can expand the amount of labor we're doing using computers to do some of that labor. We can expand what we know about a system. We can speed up the pipeline potentially by taking some of the more mundane, repetitive tasks that we do on a day-to-day basis and automating them. But you know, those are some of the things that I see people envisioning from this. It's a grand vision for test automation, and the fact is the payoff can be huge. It can be absolutely enormous, and I want to call that out right away to begin with, because I think many times we're concerned whether or not our vision is something that can be reality. And it can in some cases. In fact, I want to bring up some real-world payoffs that we've experienced here at Beaufort Fairmont with our clients. So I've taken client names off of this, just call them Project A, B, C, D, and E. They're ordered from top to bottom just in terms of time frame. So Project A was an earlier one, Project E is a more recent one. And you'll notice over on the right, these were all different types of tests from Mike Cohn's pyramid of test automation. And so the top one included UI tests, that top level of the pyramid. The next three were all service layer projects. So we were working on APIs, testing integration tests, doing white box testing with subsystems of applications. And then you'll also see unit testing down at the bottom. And generally, I don't like to touch that. I like developers to do it. But every once in a while, it makes sense to have someone else come in and look at your unit tests and help you out when they have certain expertise like we do at Beaufort Fairmont. So these numbers here I gathered up from each of our projects over time, and the way that I'm measuring ROI here, and there are probably a lot of ways to measure ROI, but in general, this is the way that or rather specifically for these numbers, what I've done is said that ROI is automation labor created, so the labor that's created through automation minus the amount of time and labor that it costs to develop that automation over the automation, the development of that cost. And each of those labor numbers, I've tried to use very conservative numbers. I've gone back and taken the number of hours that we've used to create test automation. I've gone back and looked at how long would it have taken to run this test case as a manual tester by hand, and then multiplied that by an hourly rate that was also very reasonable and conservative. So these are the things that we've done recently. There can be an enormous payoff. When you look at this net gain here, that's the net, that's minus the cost that went into it. So when you see 3 full-time equivalent folks over the course of 84 weeks or a year and a half approximately, a little over a year and a half, that's a huge, huge gain. And these things, of course, are cumulative. This is using, all of these use continuous integration, so I'm counting in every run of those as well. But I wanted to bring that out to tell you there are real world payoffs. There are real numbers here that can absolutely affect a lot of things. If you are a manager, if you're a director, it can definitely affect your budget if you're able to communicate this effectively. So all of this kind of leads back, when we're making the case for test automation engineers, this all leads back to a certain set of problems. We talked about the speed of deployment. We talked about things like taking labor into consideration and trying to use test automation to limit the amount of labor we put into things, or use that labor elsewhere. On things like testers, manual testers, doing more exploratory testing and getting deeper into the product, those types of things, which I believe in very strongly. I think we always need hands-on testers that are not writing code in almost every case. But there are some other things going on in testing today, and they are that we're introducing a lot more systems into the mix. So we have more third parties involved in our development efforts. That's just what's going on. We have an API economy out there. We have microservices and service-based architectures that are exposed from our organization to others and other organizations into ours. We have code that's now very easily tapping into other resources internally. So we have more integrations internally with existing applications, with new applications. We have them a lot with mergers and acquisitions. So over time, more and more software companies, more and more companies are realizing that they have a major asset in their software and in their digital assets, and they're realizing that over time, as they acquire other companies and as they merge with other companies, there are more integrations with these things. We have more legacy systems accumulating over time, and I think this is one thing that's just overlooked. I think it's very easy to forget that while almost every one of us in the technical world in software would love to go in and replace an old system when we get the chance. It's very, very rare that that happens. In fact, most of the time what I see happening is that we do a cost analysis of replacing the old system with something new. And when we look at a system that's been around for 20 years, it's easy on a day-to-day basis to overlook everything that it's doing. But when you do that cost analysis of creating a new system in its place, you realize very, very quickly the amount of time and effort and energy and brain power and expertise that's gone into creating that system. And you realize that there is a huge gap in what you can deliver in any reasonable time frame. And so it's very rare that we get to the point where we actually replace an existing system. So these are accumulating over time. And in fact, I would go so far as to say it's probably common, I would say it would be an aggressive stat to say that for every 2 systems we try to replace, 1 system is actually replaced. I think the number would be more like for every 4 systems or every 5 systems we make a significant effort to replace, meaning we get into the implementation stage of the project, that we actually replace 1, 4 to 1, something along those lines. And I think that might even be aggressive. So we've got systems that are building up over time, and what we're doing is we're putting facades and adapters and new technology in between us and them so that we can communicate in a way that's familiar to the new software and to us. So that's happening all the time, and I just think that it's worth mentioning that the software engineer industry is now more than 60 years old. We've had people live entire lifespans, unfortunately short ones if it's in that period of time, but definitely multiple people going through their careers in those 60 years. And so the knowledge that we've had earlier on and 60 years ago for creating these mainframes that banks are still using today, it's gone. It's not going to come back. There's no way we could ever write it down to the extent that we would like to have it written down. And if we did, we would still have questions like we do with everything that we write down. So this is the problem with testing today. The surface area for what we test is huge. It's absolutely enormous, and it's not getting any smaller. It's getting bigger by the moment, and it's growing at a non-linear pace. It's growing very, very fast. So this is kind of where we're at. In order to deal with the surface area increasing, we've got to have tools to do it. We can't assume that human beings are going to be able to go in and give us a serious, clear, concise, and robust understanding of what we're testing in nearly all cases anymore by hand. We just can't. We have to use tools to do these. There's just too much work to be done. And once again, I'm not saying, and you won't hear me say that test automation should replace humans. That's not what I believe. But we need to find ways to supplement what humans are already doing well. We need to take what humans don't like doing and use that for test automation. And the complex problems that need more detailed, more consistent, more structured understandings and behaviors and activities in testing, those are the ones we need computers to do. We need the analytical, creative things from human beings. So we've kind of explained the vision, we've explained the payoff, we've talked about the broader problem, and now let's talk about what you've tried. And I want to bring this up because if we don't talk about how we're trying to get our test automation engineers, then we don't necessarily know what it takes to make one and what the value is of one to begin with. So these are some of the things that I see again and again. I see organizations going in and taking testers who have never seen code before and converting them to programmers, to test automation engineers. And I label these as anti-patterns for organizations, organizational anti-patterns. Now, some testers will have had exposure to code in the past, and they will have either chosen not to do it, or they will have found that they weren't good at it and don't want to continue on with it, or they have no exposure so far, which means that your ramp-up time for an activity like converting all of these folks over to test automation engineers and programmers is going to be very long. That's going to be a very big ramp-up for those individuals. I also believe for this first bullet that developers, software engineers, test automation engineers have a different type of thinking and a different kind of gift that they're given in terms of understanding and being able to write and create code. Testers have a whole other set of gifts that they're given with being able to receive an application, look for certain things, have a sense of what's going on behind the scenes, and be able to expose issues between what we expected the system to do and what it actually does, and then communicating that back to people who can make decisions. But this first one I see a lot of people wanting to do, to convert all of their testers into test automation engineers. And I want to mention really quickly, so my experience has been that that's an anti-pattern. However, I know that some people do succeed with this. I know that Microsoft had a big effort to do this. They changed over to SDETs fully, and there are papers written up out there about that. Google has a book out there by Jason Arbon and another gentleman, I can't remember his name right now. I think it's Whitaker, if I remember. And they talk about how Google moved into using SDETs exclusively and developers exclusively for testing. So it can be done, and but it takes effort, and it takes some pretty big choices to be made with regard to how that's going to happen. So a friend of mine, we have a mutual friend, and we met through that mutual friend, and now this is a friend, Jennifer Scandarito is going to be out at Star West, which is a TechWell event out in Anaheim. I'm going to be out there as well. We both knew that we were going to be out there. Our friend noticed that we were, and she says, you guys need to meet because you need to have a beer when you're out there. So I'm still hoping I get that beer with Jennifer. But we got together on the phone to talk about what she's going to speak about at Star West. And I'm not going to ruin any surprises for you from her talk, but she has put effort into this first one, and she is seeing success. And so she's doing an experience report there. I think it's going to be terrific. My understanding is this is her first conference to speak at, and I hope that everyone goes out to see her that's going to be out at Star West. It's going to be a very nice presentation. But I really enjoyed talking to her about that. I think that everybody comes at this in a different way when they try to convert testers over to software test automation engineers. And it's something that in some cases I've seen it work to some degrees. I have not seen it work as well as Google or Microsoft, and Jennifer has her own take on this and her own process for how she's done it, so make sure to look her up. Developers exclusively creating test automation, my friend Angie Jones loves to talk about this. She did a really great paper, or not paper, but a post on her blog and on LinkedIn about why developers should not create test automation. And I thought it was very, very good. I use the word exclusively, meaning no one else works on test automation except for developers in this anti-pattern. And I've seen this again and again. The roles, the responsibilities, the types of thinking, the experience, the depth of knowledge with tool sets, the problem set that we try to solve are different between developers and test automation engineers. Certainly, you can take a developer and go in and write test automation. You can take a developer to use some of their time to do this. You can have them one sprint go in and do some of these kinds of things, and you can see success. But what we're talking about here today, I'll remind you, is making the case for full-time test automation engineers. So we're going to come back to that in a minute. I see people ignoring the test automation barrier to entry, and this is a term that I pull from marketing and sales, but the barrier to entry term. Test automation barrier to entry. And I've realized lately that while we have these enormous views of our vision and what test automation should and can do, there is a minimum amount of effort we have to put into it in order to make it work. And I'm calling that minimum amount of effort the barrier to entry. A lot of people just ignore that, or they don't know that it's there. And I know how to enunciate that for my clients, and I know how to get them past that point. So we work a lot with clients to help them understand how much effort it's going to take to get where they want to go. I see a lot of folks take a non-committal approach to test automation. So I love talking about my kids. I don't share much about them when I'm online and when I'm on with you all, but today I will. My older son was learning to walk up an escalator, and escalators for boys and maybe for girls as well, but I'm speaking from my perspective, they're like the coolest thing in the world, right? When you're little, there's stairs that move, and you get to go up to a whole other floor, and they're mechanical, and it's flat at one point, and then it moves up somehow. It's just the coolest thing ever. And so, of course, when you're a little boy, you want to do this as early as possible. And so I remember one of the first times that he was going up an escalator, and he put one foot on a step, and the step was moving, and he left one foot back on the floor. And he's stretching out farther and farther like a gymnast doing a split. And I'm like, Thomas, you've got to commit. You have to jump in and commit on this. And eventually I was able to lift him up and get him onto a step. All of this on a very narrow escalator. And we still struggle with that every once in a while. But, you know, I see a lot of teams taking this very same approach where they want to leave one foot where they were and put another foot into this new area, or individuals on teams wanting to take that role. And test automation is something where you have to jump in with both feet. You have to make a commitment. You have to reach this barrier of entry that we're going to talk about a little bit more as we go on. It's not one of those things where you can kind of ease your way into the pool. And, you know, there are things that you can do that with. There are initiatives you can do that with. Test automation, I have not found to be one of those. Timeshare test automation. This is another anti-pattern that I see all the time. So timeshare in the sense of, okay, so I have a friend who has a timeshare in Vegas, and he'll go there 4 times a year to enjoy that area and enjoy all that it has to offer, and the hotel or condo or whatever it is, and he uses it 4 times a year. Well, I see a lot of people taking a test automation engineer and providing them as if they're a timeshare, where 4 teams use them, use time slices from them. And so maybe their day is split between 3 or 4 of those teams, or maybe each sprint they move around from one team to the next. And that can work in some ways in some organizations. It can work when you're small, when you have maybe 1 or 2 test automation engineers and you share them between 1 or 2 or 3 teams, and those teams are very, very small, maybe 2 or 3 developers on each. Maybe something like that could work. In most cases, the reason that we have a project team at all is that we have some non-simplistic application that we're dealing with, and we need multiple people to think very hard about it, to build it out, to create it, to make sure that it's right, and to make sure that it does what we expect it to do. And so sharing out someone who is going to automate part of the testing for it and automate tools that assist in the testing for that application is something that is just very, very difficult to share. Now, there are situations where maybe you have a center of excellence within a larger organization, and you have folks that are acting almost as if an architect would on a typical software development project, and they're kind of keeping projects in line along the way. So maybe you have 4 or 5 projects that all have test automation going on, or 10 or 12 or whatever the number is. Maybe in that case you have someone who jumps down and takes a sprint with one particular team, and then, you know, spends a few hours over here and consults over there, you know, a couple days and that kind of thing. But in general, sharing a particular test automation engineer doesn't work. We don't do it with developers. Why would we do it with test automation engineers? And we also have this tendency to not account for test automation engineers' time on projects. And I find this to be pretty consistent across teams, that we're very quick to make sure that we have tasks for development. Sometimes we have tasks for testing, but it's more rare that we have tasks for test automation. It's also very rare, in my experience, to see teams accounting for how much time individuals have spent on particular tasks and learning from that over time in order to allocate better in the future. And I know the word allocate probably rings wrong for some folks. Forgive me for the wrong word choice. I don't have the right one right now. But those are some of the anti-patterns that I see with this. So I want to get into this role and what it means, and this can help you build your case here. So we talked kind of through the problems, we talked about the vision, what we want to accomplish, what different teams might want to accomplish. Let's continue to make this case here. So we've talked about what not to do in creating a test automation engineer. So if you had to design a test automation engineer, how would you do it? I wanted to look at the responsibilities. I was out at a client, and many of my clients have this very same question. They say, you know, how much time should a test automation engineer spend on a project, and why should I have one dedicated specifically to one project? Does it always have to be one project and one test automation engineer? All these types of things. And the truth is, I sat down and I thought about my experience as a tester, my experience as a developer, and my experience as an automation engineer. And just in sheer number of responsibilities, when I just counted up the number of responsibilities, I realized that the number of responsibilities I had as an automation engineer was significantly more than either of those other 2 roles. And so what I wanted to do was kind of put those in front of you and say, what do we expect from this role? What are the responsibilities that we have? Well, we have to create new code as test automation engineers, just like dev. We have to maintain code that we've written in the past. Now, remember, in a lot of situations, we have developers who will be focused on new code, and then we'll split off and have another team for maintenance. So many times in the development world, we'll have maintenance developers who are focused and allocated specifically to maintenance roles. And then we'll also have folks that are specifically allocated to new code. But we don't necessarily do that with test automation, do we? And I don't know if it's because it's a relatively new role. I don't know that it's necessarily new, but it's one that we're identifying more recently in the last 10 or 15 years. I don't know exactly why that is, but I think it's something to be aware of. In general, for testers and for test automation engineers, we have to have a broad view of the system under test. Now, there are certainly developers who have a broad view of the system under test, but many times there is a need for a developer to have a narrow view of a piece of functionality rather than a broad view of the system under test. And I've talked about that in previous webinars, so I'm not going to get back into that today. But the automation engineer has to do both. They have to switch back and forth. They have to be able to look at the system with a really big, wide-angle camera and understand what's going on from this end to that end, what might be going on, all of that, in order to work with testers, in order to find issues, in order to find things that differ between expectations and reality. But in addition to that, they have to be able to narrow down and work on one piece of code. And that's difficult for a lot of people to do, to switch back and forth, that context shifting. So we also have to support. So test automation engineers have to support the product that they've got out there. Now, plenty of devs do this in plenty of teams. But many times, and especially with larger organizations, the support of an application is handed off to a support group, a customer support group, and testers don't necessarily have that responsibility. Developers don't necessarily have it. We hand it off to a customer support, customer satisfaction type of organization. Automation engineers don't usually get to hand off their code. They are supporting it with internal users that can come by and tap them on the shoulder any day of the week, any hour of the day, and say, hey, I've got a problem with this piece of test automation or with a CI build that's breaking, and they have to go support it. We have in-house customers, I just mentioned, troubleshooting automation. So, of course, devs have to go in and troubleshoot when they find a defect or a bug. Test automation engineers have to do that almost daily when tests fail in CI. The first question we're asking when CI fails is, was it the test automation code? If it wasn't, has the system changed? If it hasn't, is this a problem with the code base and who do I need to talk to? So we're always troubleshooting our own code, we're troubleshooting the system as a whole and trying to understand what goes on in order to provide back more than just this is the difference between what we expected with the system and this is what actually happens. We're providing back information about this is what I saw the system do in this case, in this environment, with this particular use case, and this is what I saw that I thought should happen. So there's a lot of troubleshooting there with that. Diagnosis of the system under test, I mentioned that a little bit there. Creation of test cases. So developers rarely are involved in that. Testers are. Test automation engineers need to be involved in that too. I don't look at the role of automation engineer as simply being one to come in and repeat in code what has been written out by hand by testers who are humans. I don't think that's effective. I don't think it's valuable. I don't think it's efficient. I don't think it makes sense in most cases. The reason is, when we create a test case as a human being, we have certain ticks. We have certain things going on in our mind, like if I'm already logged in and looking at the profile page, I may as well just verify everything on that page while I'm there. We don't want to waste that time. We'd rather just do it while we're there. What are the chances that it's different if I log out and log back in? And if it is, then fine, we'll write a test case for that. But a computer doesn't care about that. A piece of code does not care whether or not it needs to log out and log back in. So you can separate out all of those verification points, and in many cases we should. In my experience, what I like to see with test automation is I like to see test cases that are reduced down to one particular responsibility, that have one reason and one reason only for failing, one reason and one reason only for existing. So that when I see in a report that that test case failed, I know exactly why it failed. I don't have to dig into any logs. I don't have to look at what happened. I don't need screenshots. I know exactly why it failed. So in a lot of cases, I like that. But we do need to be involved in test case creation as automation engineers. Experiment with the SUT. Absolutely. We need to be in there. All three of us need to be in there working with the SUT and trying to figure out what's going on. Communicating with users, and that may be For the developer, the users of their product. For test automation engineers, it may be the users of their product, which is the test automation. So it may be developers, it may be testers, it may be product owners, it may be somebody else. Testing skills, I think those are required, and then development skills are required as well. So hopefully by writing this out, I can show that at least the number of responsibilities is different with this particular role. I'm not saying that I'm not filling up one column to say we're better than anybody else. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying that the number of responsibilities may be different. The value of each one of those for different roles may be very different as well. So, but I just want to bring that up. These are the types of things when you're making the case for an automation engineer. If this is something that's new to your company, you need to be able to write out what are the responsibilities of this individual. What are they going to be doing on a day-to-day basis? And speaking of day-to-day basis, I wanted to bring that up, and I wanted to talk through maybe a day in the life of a test automation engineer. And this may look familiar to you. Maybe you've experienced this in your own world, but I like to start early, so 7:30 a.m. I'm up, checking continuous integration to see what's going on. Within 10 minutes, I'm troubleshooting failed test cases. So what is it? Every morning I wake up and there's something that failed. Maybe not every morning, but every other morning, every 4 or 5 mornings, something along those lines. And well, I've got to change context from that over to my Scrum meeting at 9 a.m. So I'll context shift there, and then at 10 o'clock, during that hour, of course, we don't want Scrums to last that long, but usually there's some fallout conversation, there's some spin-off conversation, there's a cup of coffee that I need to get by that point in time, take a little break, and then get back in gear and start fixing that test automation and the defects that I found within it. Give it a break for lunch, and at 1 p.m. I'm back and coding new test automation. So note here that this, to me, feels like a pretty typical day in the life of a test automation engineer. And more than one half of the day already has been spent on things other than creating new test automation. And I'm a big proponent of spending as much time as possible heads down in the code for test automation. And when I say as much as possible, I want it to be understood that I also expect all the other things we've talked about from test automation engineers, which means I'm not saying 100% of one's time should be heads down. I'm saying that in addition to all these other great things, like working with the team and making sure we understand requirements and stories and all this other type of stuff, in addition to that, we're spending as much time as possible heads down in the code. 1:15, what do you know, the CI failed. And so we're back at that again, trying to fix problems. By 2 o'clock, I'm back into the new automation code that I'm writing. And by 4 o'clock, maybe I've gotten that particular task done, and I'll be out collaborating with testers or scribes, or maybe I'll be working with my developers. I want to take a break real quick before we kind of wrap up the presentation portion of this. I want to answer a few questions. I also want to go back and look at one other thing before I get into those questions. Feel free to start typing those out as I'm getting into this. I mentioned here the timeshare test automation. I mentioned non-committal approaches. Many times I walk into organizations and I find that the person who is responsible for doing test automation is very happy for me to be there. And we start talking and I say, okay, well, tell me about your test automation. How often do you work on it? You say, well, I work on it every day. I'm like, that's great. That's great. Now tell me about every day, how long you're working on that test automation. I say, well, sometimes I get a really good chunk of time in there and I do about an hour a day. And to me, that's not even close. That's this minimum barrier to entry kind of idea. So if you have one person on your team that is your test automation engineer, and they're working 1 hour out of an 8-hour day to write code to make a new test automation initiative work, that's just simply not enough time. And what's more is generally that person is new to the role. They're new to coding. And so it's going to take even longer to see progress with that. I've mentioned in these presentations in the past my experience with writing code, but I know many of you are new, so I'm going to share this again. If you've heard it before, just ignore it. But I know for myself, it was very difficult to get a computer science degree. I wasn't prepared for it in the way that other folks were. It took a lot of effort on my part to learn how to write code, to learn a lot of the fundamentals of computer science. It was difficult for me. It took me some effort. And then when I got out of that degree and moved into being a professional software engineer, it took about 2 years before I felt like I was proficient at writing software. And remember, when you're new at something, you usually recognize proficiency or expertise much earlier than it actually happens. So that's when I felt it, not necessarily when it actually happened. So 2 years into my career, so now I've gone through a whole computer science degree and 2 years, all day long, every day, writing code. And I was working more than 40 hours a week, of course, because to me, I knew this was the beginning of my career and that success with this would compound over my career, and I wanted to be successful and I wanted to write code better. So I'd be working on it 45, 50, 55 hours a week and working very hard, and I might even have side projects to learn new things. So over a course of 2 years, I became what I felt was proficient at writing software. Now let's contrast that to the idea that I was just talking about, where we have a person who has not usually got a computer science degree. So the fundamentals aren't there to learn a lot of these things. The experience with software isn't there. The experience with writing software isn't there. Then let's add in that we're going to work 1 out of an 8-hour day, 1 hour out of an 8-hour day. How long is it going to take them to reach the proficiency with writing software? I mean, that's 16 years, right? 2 years times 1 hour a day, or sorry, 8 hours a day. They're only doing 1. So 1/8, 16 years. Now, most of us don't have time to wait 16 years for someone to become proficient in this. I think most of us don't even take that type of math into consideration, because I don't think that most of the managers doing the planning for these teams and the resourcing of these teams are not aware of it. So I want to call that out to you. It takes a lot of time to learn to program. Test automation is a lot of programming. It's probably the biggest skill within test automation is programming. So let's think about what we actually want to accomplish, how long it's going to take, and where we need to be with our skills and our skill sets before we start expecting unreasonable things. And I think that it is completely unreasonable to expect any test automation initiative to move forward with a person working 1 hour a day who doesn't have a background in these types of things. It's just too much to learn. It's too much to do. So I said I would go back and answer some questions here. So we had a question by Neha, and it says, what will the future of manual testing as the automation has overpowered these days? And I think what Neha is saying is it seems like test automation is more and more present, and this individual is using the word overpowered. And I can see how folks may feel that in some organizations. Personally, I don't think there's an overpowering that can happen. I don't think that it can happen by nature, because we're going to need human beings for testing. That's just the way that it is. We need people to work on these applications by hand. We need for them to use pieces of test automation to understand the application, to come up with the concepts of what we need to test and how we need to test it, to drive the test automation forward, to understand the application deeper. Once again, the surface area that we're working on here is so expansive that it's going to take a lot of human beings plus a lot of test automation to do that. So what will the future of manual testing be? I think that it's going to be there for a long time. I hope it will. That's a great question, Neha. So here's another question. I'm going to try to read it real quick before I... Okay, this is from Jim, and I know Jim over the internet. We may have met at some point. I think he speaks at some conferences, and he's fairly well known in the testing industry, so I appreciate you being on, Jim, and your comments and questions. So Jim says, automation is about efficiency gains by leveraging the economies of scale afforded by running on multiple machines in parallel. Automation is about efficiency gains. Okay, so you typed it twice. Well, that's one thing that automation is about, and I totally understand where you're coming from, Jim. I think that's a terrific comment. I had this conversation the other day with a developer who reduced a task down to a problem of efficiency. And this is something that lately has been a fun conversation to have, although it's one of those that I feel like I'm repeating quite a bit lately. But I said, you know, what other benefits might be able to come out of this aside from efficiency, or what other ideas might we think about in terms of this task aside from efficiency? He just looked at me like, oh, it's crazy. I said, well, you know, hey, I'm a developer. I have worked with developers my whole career. I've been a tester. I'm a test automation engineer. I'm a technical person. I love efficiencies. Absolutely, I like efficiencies. But efficiency doesn't matter much if there's not also an efficacy. We have to present value to our customers in order for them to buy anything. I'll give you an example. So there was a shared workspace that I know of that a friend of mine created. And when he created it, he went out and was very efficient with his funds. And he bought used furniture and had these all over the place. So there were these mixed matched chairs. Some of them were office chairs, some of them kitchen chairs, some stools, and the tables were all mixed and matched. He was very efficient on the indoors place, so he didn't redo the property. He didn't specify in the leasehold that he could do that. He didn't do it himself. He didn't go through and do a lot of marketing on it as well, because he knew a lot of software engineers as well. He knew people that worked from home. He knew a lot of folks who would be interested in the co-working space. So he was very, very efficient on that. Well, that business doesn't exist anymore because he was so efficient he forgot to think about value, or he didn't know to think about value. So we have to present things in such a way that customers want them. We have to get value out of things. There are lots of other factors involved aside from efficiency. So I hear what you're saying. Automation can be, I'm going to rephrase this, automation can be about efficiency gains, absolutely. It can be about a lot of other things as well. So I'm going to skip by another Jim question here and go into some others since we have other folks on here. So Tom says, curious as to why in this table, and I'm going to go back and try to figure out which table this is. Curious as to why in this table testers do not communicate with users while developers do. So let's go back to I believe, this one. You know what, I think, please, so I was creating this, Tom, right before I presented this today. Like I said, this is the first time I presented it. That's a terrific point. You know, I think it's great when testers can interact with users. I don't know that it's as common as we may like. I certainly, as a tester, would like to understand a user's perspective, but I don't know that it's required. I also think that a lot of times as testers, we believe our role is to be a proxy for the user or to protect the user, and I don't believe that at this point in my career. I believed it in the past, but I don't believe it right now. There's a lot of pressure in that. It would mean that you would have to know every user, you would have to understand all of their wants and desires, and that you are a representative for them. And that you would be able to be good at that. And I can't imagine a single human being being able to be good at that for any large user base application. And I know you didn't say that, Tom, but I guess that's a part of this. I don't see testers getting out with users a lot. So while it may be a responsibility in some organizations, and I think it would be a terrific one for everyone on the development team to get out and work with users as much as possible, to see what they're doing, to understand where they're coming from, for that to be another layer on top of their experience and another lens through which to look at the application. I don't think it happens as much as some people might think. So yeah, absolutely, that could be added on there, and maybe I should change that. Thanks so much for bringing that up, Tom. Once again, I'm gonna see who else we have on here. We have Frank. And I don't know where I've met Frank, but he knows that I like golf. He says, how do you ever get around to golfing with that busy schedule? I don't anymore. So if you've got a way to make that happen for me, please do, because I would love to play golf lately. Oh, and we've got our friends from Cengage on today. They join us almost every time. They get together in a room for this with their whole team, and they do this together each time we have a presentation. I absolutely love it. I'm looking forward to doing some more work with them sometime soon. So who are scribes? Are they manual testers, business analysts, or product owners? So this is referring back to, let me find this. I kind of threw this in here, JP, so thanks for seeing it. Where was it? I missed it. I have missed it. Let's see, not there. It was either here, no. Here, no. Okay, at the bottom of this slide, so it says collaborating with tester scribe. You know what? I threw that in there. A lot of times, what I like to see with test automation initiatives, and not every time, but sometimes what can work very well, is to divide out 3 roles within test automation engineering, and those 3 roles would be scribe, automation engineer, and developer. And the functions of those roles are the scribe would actually create the test case, meaning they would create the script that's going to actually run and execute. And that's usually done in a human readable format using something like a Cucumber or a robot framework or Gauge or one of the other tools that's out there for that type of thing. The automation engineer is creating the interfaces for that human readable piece. And so tester and the scribe, the test automation engineer, they have to work very closely together. Many times that scribe, and you know what developer is, that was the third role. Developer is the person who's writing the code under test. But the scribe is generally a tester. It can be a product owner. If you look back at BDD and kind of how BDD came about and what the promise of BDD was, the promise was this idea that product owners would be writing their stories and that we would be able to execute them, and so we could offload some of the designation of what the product should do into a persisted executable state, which is this test script, and that the product owner would do it. Well, I think that's where BDD kind of fell down, is that is not the reality in most organizations that I see. So you asked, kind of embedded in your question was, can a product owner be a scribe? Absolutely, although it's much more rare in my experience. Thanks for the question over there. I hope you guys are having a good day. This is a very long question, and I'm not sure how we're going to have time for it, so I'm going to skip it for right now. Here's another one. Let's see. Let me get back to, we've got a lot of the same people asking questions, so we're going to go through repeats. If you have questions, here's one raising their hand. So I'm going to try this out. Yogesh, I'm going to take you off of mute if I can figure out how to do it here. Give me 1 second. Okay, let's see if this works. Okay, Yogesh, are you there? Yogesh Bande, you have your hand up? Hello? We may not have a mic there, so let me take that off. I apologize for the trying to get him off mute. There we go. Now he's back on mute. Sorry about the background noise there. Anybody else has a hand up? I'm going to look for this. Sorry we missed you, Yogesh. Let's go back through some of these other questions. Anything else that's coming up that you have thoughts about, let me know. On your last point, I relate that to not doing the upfront planning time and cost. They don't plan first, they just go do it. So this is from Jim again. You know, I think you're talking about planning for test automation initiatives. I don't know exactly which point you're talking about. I think you're exactly right in some respects. I know that I have experienced test automation that was emergent, meaning that it came about through the act of doing it, but we still had certain goals, whether they were immediate goals, obvious like day-to-day, almost instantaneous goals, or whether they were long-term goals. And one of the things that I do when I'm working with clients is I want those goals as early as possible. I want to know what your intention is with test automation. What are your intentions with my test automation? You know, I hope that that comes through. I love to be goal-based and to work on that. Each team is different. Each team has a different ability to see out in front of it, a different ability to reach what's out in front of it, a different pace, a different momentum. Each team has a different skill set that enable or disable those things or hinder them. So I think it's just important to sit down and get to know the team, and that's what I like to do. You know, I always have a question on here. One of the things I do is consulting, and that's a part of this process, but the way that process begins is to sit down on the phone and to talk together and to figure out, what is your team like? What are you doing? What is it that you want to do with test automation? How do you want to get there? How have you tried to get there in the past? And that helps me kind of gauge exactly where we're going to move and where we're going to be able to move with this. But sitting down and doing that initial consultation, but before doing project work, is that second step, making sure that we have a plan in place, that we know what the intentions are. So I think you're absolutely right, Jim. I love that comment. Thank you so much. And let's see. So spend a lot of time on automation. So this is from Frank. I spend a lot of time on automation, but I'm only about 2 years into this role. I still contribute to manual testing. My question is, our organization is truly only 2 QA engineers writing automation for 2 different applications. My question, what level do we need to achieve to be confident automation engineers or SDETs? Do we need to set up our project to encapsulate such things as modules, classes, etc.? It's also hard when our developers are not writing in the language we are. You speak of getting a computer science degree. This may not be an option to achieving those goals. Will this be a setup for failure? Boy, you know what? We need to spend some time together, Frank. There's a lot of questions here. A lot of these GEMS libraries that we are using are written by developers who can be hard to translate as a person who doesn't have a lot of programming background. So number one, I do not believe that it's necessary to get a computer science degree. I think that the large majority of folks in test automation don't have one. I see plenty of people succeed in their careers without that. I think the main thing in succeeding in just about any field is how much you're willing to put into it, how hard you're willing to work, what you're willing to learn. So just never stop learning, constantly be seeking out things. Twitter is a great place for that. There are a lot of folks that I follow and that I tweet about all the time that have great blog posts, places to read about these kinds of things. Frank, if you send me a note, paul@beaufortfairmont.com, I'll send you all of my references for blog posts and my whole library for that to give you some more resources. How effective do you, what level do you need in order to be confident about being an automation engineer? You know, this is so funny. I was listening to a podcast just the other day by Andy Kaufman, who does a podcast about project management. I saw him keynote at a conference, and he did a terrific job, so I started listening to him a little bit. And he was talking the other day about the fact that many people assume that competence precedes confidence. And I thought that was so interesting to talk about that as being an assumption, because I certainly have felt that. And he said, you know, the fact is that if you're waiting to be competent at something prior to being confident in it, you may be waiting a really, really long time. And so anyway, I'll encourage you to go look up Andy Kaufman's podcast. But, you know, the confidence that's going to come with automation engineering or with anything else is going to come through trial and error, or it's going to come through being a confident person and just learning how to be confident in general. I really don't think that the competence or the ability and the confidence have anything to do with each other, or at least when I have seen them each be helpful, they have not been related. So, but certainly I understand where you're coming from. You want to have a scheme that works. You want to have test automation that works, that you feel confident in, that you feel confident in your test automation. That's going to come with time. We can definitely sit down and figure out what that means for you and for your organization anytime, Frank, especially when you're asking me about golf questions earlier. So here's John. Oh yeah, so John is, thanks so much, John, for pointing this out. The NCPMI gig is August the 21st, not July the 21st. You are correct. Thanks for pointing that out. Here's a couple more questions. We're kind of running out of time here. I've got two more slides. I'm going to read one more question and move on. In your experience, do developers make good automation test code reviewers? We tend to review each other's code as automation engineers. Tom, I think sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. I think it depends on where you're coming from. I have seen some really, really terrific code written by developers for test automation engineers that was completely unhelpful. And by that I mean we've got to understand our audience when we're writing code, and test automation engineers many times don't have that same level of fundamental understanding of things to do things. So developers going to want to use every trick in the book to get something done in order to make things easier or cooler or whatever it is. Some developers are that way. I shouldn't generalize all of them, but a lot of them are that way. And really, test automation engineers may not need that much to get the job done, and it may take them a lot longer to work with those types of features than otherwise. So does a developer in that case make a good code reviewer? Sometimes they can. You can learn a lot from somebody who's got more experience from you. But I think as long as the understanding is there that we're writing test automation, we may not have to know every single detail of every single line of code and every single technique in order to write good test automation. I know there are a couple more questions out here. I will be happy to get back to you. Send me a note if I didn't answer your question, paul@beaufortfairmont.com. I'm going to leave you with this from my friend Angie. She said in a recent post, which was out on her website, it was entitled "Why Developers Should Never Lead Your Automation Efforts," and I've got a reference to it here in this slide deck. She said, do yourself and the entire team a favor and stop asking your developers who know nothing about automation to lead your efforts. Hire an automation engineer. Those are strong words from a strong woman. These are some of the references that I used, and I understand that it is self-referential. I hope that's not a problem for some of you, but I have a couple things on there from my own collection on my blog. You can find my blog out, beaufortfairmont.com/blogs or /blog. These webinars are always recorded. I always try to have one of these recordings out a day or two, business day or two after I do them. So so look for those, look for old ones on the webinars page, beaufortfairmont.com/webinars. I mentioned I love to talk through folks' challenges, where you are with test automation, what your problems are today, and make sure to reach out to me either through email, and we can set up a time, paul@beaufortfairmont.com, or through our corporate number there. Make sure to leave a message on that if you call that, 984-244-2313. I appreciate everybody being here. Let me know, send me a note and let me know what you want to learn about next, because these are for you. I'm doing them for you. I want to make sure that you're getting out of them what you want. So thank you so much for your time, for being here, for spending this time with me. I look forward to getting to know each of you better. Follow me on Twitter, @paulmerrill, and just make sure to connect. I'll be in Atlanta in the Alpharetta area next week, in the middle of the week, so if you're in that area, reach out to me and let's find some time to get a coffee or something, okay? Thank you so much, and everybody have a wonderful day.